If you love stories about underdogs who silence their critics, like and subscribe right now so you don't miss the incredible moment when these arrogant cadets get their reality check. This one will blow your mind. Let's dive in. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parade ground at Fort Campbell Military Academy, one of the nation's most prestigious military schools. Dozens of uniformed cadets stood at attention, their posture perfect, their eyes forward. They represented the best and brightest young men and women in military training, or at least that's what they believed about themselves. Captain James Mitchell stood at the front of the assembly, his voice commanding as he addressed the morning formation. "We have a new cadet joining our program as a transfer student," he announced. "Her name is Second Lieutenant Sarah Chen. She'll be joining Training Group 3. The cadets exchanged quick glances. A transfer? That was unusual. And a woman? Most of the cadets in Advanced Special Operations training were men. Whispers rippled through the ranks, quickly stifled as officers scanned the crowd for violations of protocol. Then Sarah walked onto the parade ground. She was small, maybe 5'4", with dark hair pulled back in a tight military bun. She wore her uniform like everyone else, but something about her seemed different. She kept her eyes down. Her shoulders were slightly rounded. She walked with a careful, almost tentative pace rather than the confident military stride expected of cadet officers. She looked nervous. She looked out of place. She looked, frankly, like she didn't belong here. The cadets immediately made their judgment. "Great," whispered Marcus, a tall, muscular cadet with the swagger of someone who'd been succeeding his entire military career. "Another transfer who's probably going to slow us all down. Look at her. She looks like she'd rather be anywhere else." His friend Derek, standing next to him in formation, smirked. "She looks like she's never fired a weapon in her life. How did she even get accepted into this program?" By lunchtime, the jokes had already started. Sarah sat alone at a table in the cafeteria, eating quietly, not making eye contact with anyone. The cadets around her whispered and pointed. Someone made a comment loud enough for her to hear about diversity hires and special treatment. Others questioned whether she had the physical strength to complete the program. A few cadets openly laughed about her quiet demeanor, suggesting she'd wash out within a week. "Did you see her during the morning fitness test?" Marcus said to a group of his friends as they walked past Sarah's table. "She barely ran a 5-minute mile. In 6 weeks, she's going to be crying in her bunk." Sarah said nothing. She kept eating, kept her eyes on her plate. If she heard the comments, she gave no indication. This only made the cadets bolder. Her silence seemed like confirmation of their assumptions. She was weak. She didn't belong. She was going to fail. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah became the unofficial target of cadet mockery. It wasn't overt bullying. The academy had strict codes against that, but it was constant, subtle, and deeply effective. Cadets would accidentally knock into her in hallways. They'd speak loudly about her presumed inability to handle combat scenarios. They'd question her competence publicly during training sessions. Second Lieutenant Chun, Marcus called out during a tactical scenario training, "Maybe you should observe instead of participate. Wouldn't want you getting hurt." The other cadets laughed, though some seemed uncertain about whether this crossed a line. Sarah simply nodded and moved to the side. What the cadets didn't know was that Sarah was paying close attention to everything. She watched Marcus. She watched Derek. She watched all of them. She documented their arrogance, their assumptions, their laziness during training. She noticed that many of them relied on their reputations rather than actual skill. She observed that they cut corners when they thought no one was paying attention. Captain Mitchell had noticed too. He'd been specifically instructed to watch and evaluate these cadets. He knew exactly why Sarah was here. On a Thursday afternoon, Captain Mitchell pulled the training group together. "As you know, Special Operations Forces face tests of discipline and character that go far beyond physical ability," he said. "Tomorrow, we're implementing a new evaluation protocol. Someone will be embedded in your training group to assess your discipline, your judgment, and your leadership under pressure." The cadets exchanged excited glances. They thought this was just another standard military drill. They didn't understand that the evaluation had already begun. That evening, Sarah was called to Captain Mitchell's office. "How are you observing them?" he asked without preamble. "Undisciplined," Sarah responded. "Cocky. Most of them aren't actually as skilled as they think they are. They rely on their reputations and their assumptions about each other instead of staying sharp. And their disrespect for anyone they perceive as weaker is notable. In a real combat situation, That kind of attitude would get people killed. Captain Mitchell nodded. They need to learn that lesson. Tomorrow, we're going to teach it to them. Sarah understood her mission completely. She wasn't here to fail. She was here to test them. And tomorrow, the test would begin in earnest. The training exercise began at 0500 hours, 5 in the morning. The cadets were told they would be running a realistic combat scenario lasting 8 hours. They would need to navigate difficult terrain, solve tactical problems, and respond to unexpected situations. They were told nothing about Sarah's role. She was simply told to continue as she had been. For the first 4 hours, the exercise seemed standard. The cadets moved through the training ground, made tactical decisions, and generally performed at the level they expected. Sarah stayed on the edges, quiet, unremarkable. The cadets mostly forgot she was there. Then the scenario escalated. A simulated attack came from an unexpected direction. The cadets responded, but their response was disorganized. Marcus took command, which would have been fine, except he did so by shouting over the other cadets, refusing to hear input from anyone else. Derek suggested a flanking maneuver that would have left their weakest positions exposed. Several cadets simply followed orders without engaging their critical thinking. That's when Sarah moved. She walked into the middle of the training scenario and activated her communication device. "Freeze," she called out. "Everyone stand down." The cadets stopped, confused. They expected Captain Mitchell to emerge and provide after-action review. Instead, Sarah stepped forward and took off her training helmet. "That scenario should have taken you 45 minutes maximum," she said calmly. "You took 90. Your casualty rate in a real scenario would have been 60%. You would have failed your mission, and half your team would be dead." Marcus stepped forward, his voice aggressive. "With all due respect, Second Lieutenant, you're not qualified to critique our—" "And that," Sarah interrupted, "is exactly why you failed this scenario." She looked at each of them in turn. "You all assumed I wasn't qualified because I'm smaller than you, because I'm quieter than you, because I don't have your ego. So you didn't listen when I saw problems. You didn't respect my observations. You dismissed me without understanding anything about my actual abilities or experience." She paused, letting that sink in. In special operations, that kind of dismissal gets people killed. You might have a preference for leaders who look and act a certain way, but the enemy doesn't care about that. Your mission doesn't care about that. Reality doesn't care about that. What matters is competence. What matters is wisdom. What matters is listening to people regardless of whether they fit your predetermined image of what strength looks like. Captain Mitchell emerged from behind a tree, his expression unreadable. "Second Lieutenant Chin is correct," he announced. "And there's something else you need to know." He walked toward the cadets, and they could see the reality beginning to dawn on some of them. "Second Lieutenant Sarah Chin is not a transfer cadet undergoing evaluation," Captain Mitchell said. "She's a Special Forces instructor with 8 years of active duty experience. She's completed 3 combat deployments. She holds advanced certifications in tactical operations, weapons systems, and command leadership. She was embedded in your group specifically to evaluate your discipline, your judgment, and your ability to respect competence regardless of appearance." The cadets' faces went pale. "You failed," Captain Mitchell continued. "You didn't just fail the scenario, you failed the character test. You were so convinced of your own superiority that you couldn't see actual competence standing right in front of you. You dismissed her ability before you ever had evidence. You made assumptions based on appearance and demeanor. That's exactly the kind of thinking that leads to failed missions." Marcus looked down, his earlier swagger completely gone. Derek's face was red with embarrassment and shame. The other cadets stood in stunned silence. "Second Lieutenant Chin saw multiple opportunities for optimization during these 2 weeks," Captain Mitchell said. "She documented every assumption you made, every corner you cut, every time you relied on reputation instead of skill. She was testing whether you'd eventually recognize her competence. You didn't. What happened over the next hour was more valuable than any standard training could have been." Sarah didn't attack the cadets personally or make them feel worse than they already felt. Instead, she broke down exactly what had gone wrong during the scenario. She showed them, step by step, where their arrogance had led to poor decisions. "Here's what you missed in the first engagement," she said, pulling up tactical diagrams. Derek suggested a flanking maneuver. It would have looked good to untrained observers, but experienced soldiers would have recognized the vulnerability. "If I'd been leading this team before I proved myself to you, You wouldn't have listened to my correction because you'd already decided I wasn't worth listening to. She walked them through the specific moments where her input could have changed the outcome. She showed them how her tactical suggestions, which they'd ignored or dismissed, would have reduced their casualty estimates by 40%. The hardest lesson in military operations, Sarah explained, is learning that the person with the best idea might not be the person you expected it to come from. It might be someone who's quieter, someone who looks different, someone who hasn't already impressed you with confidence or charisma. Your job as officers is to recognize competence wherever it appears, not just where you expect to find it. She turned to Marcus directly. You're a strong leader in many ways. Your ability to take charge is valuable. But you have to learn to value input from people who approach problems differently than you do. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. To Derek, you have good tactical instincts. But you have to be willing to question those instincts and listen when someone, anyone, points out a flaw. That's not doubt. That's professionalism. Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah remained embedded with the training group, but now in her actual role as instructor. The cadets' entire approach to training changed. They listened more. They questioned their assumptions. They respected competence regardless of who possessed it. Most importantly, they learned that real strength wasn't about appearing strong. It was about being strong enough to learn from anyone. The transformation wasn't instant or complete. Pride doesn't disappear overnight. But gradually, the cadets began to understand what Captain Mitchell had tried to teach them. That military excellence requires respect for competence in all its forms. By the end of the training cycle, several cadets specifically requested to continue working with Sarah. Marcus, the former skeptic, asked her directly, "How do you stay so calm when people underestimate you?" "I don't take it personally," Sarah answered. "I understand that people make snap judgments. What matters is whether they're willing to revise those judgments when presented with evidence." You were. That matters. The story of Sarah Chun and the cadets at Fort Campbell teaches us something important that goes far beyond military training. It's a lesson about prejudgment, about assumptions, and about the cost of dismissing people before you truly know them. In today's world, we all make snap judgments about people. We see someone's appearance, their demeanor, their background, and we instantly categorize them. We decide whether they're worth listening to. We determine their competence based on whether they match our image of what competence looks like. We're all guilty of it. But the reality is that competence doesn't have a single appearance. Strength doesn't have a single form. Wisdom doesn't announce itself loudly. Sometimes the person with the best insights is the quiet one in the corner. Sometimes the leader you need is someone you initially dismissed. Sometimes the person who seems weakest is actually the strongest. What Sarah Chin demonstrated to those cadets, and what we can all learn, is that real confidence doesn't require proving itself through aggression or self-promotion. Real confidence is secure enough to let competence speak for itself, even if it takes time for others to recognize it. The cadets learned that leadership isn't about always being the loudest or the most physically impressive. Leadership is about recognizing competence, listening to good ideas regardless of their source, and having the wisdom to respect people for what they know and can do, not for whether they fit your expectations. For anyone watching this story, the lesson is clear. Don't let people's appearance, their quietness, their initial presentation determine their value. Give people a chance to demonstrate what they're actually capable of. Listen to people you initially dismissed. Be humble enough to learn from anyone, regardless of whether they match your preconceived image of expertise. And if you're the person being underestimated, do what Sarah did. Stay professional. Don't let the dismissal slow you down. Focus on doing your job excellently. Eventually, the evidence of your competence will speak louder than anyone's initial assumptions. The real victory in this story isn't that Sarah proved them wrong. It's that the cadets learned to see beyond their own biases. They learned that military excellence, and really any kind of excellence, requires the humility to recognize competence wherever it exists. That's a lesson worth remembering. That's a lesson worth applying to your own life. Because we all have moments when we're the person making assumptions, and we all have moments when we're the person being underestimated. The key is learning to navigate both situations with wisdom and grace. Final call to action. Did you see how these cadets got humbled by the quiet transfer student who turned out to be their superior officer? This story shows us that real strength is about competence, not appearances. If you loved this tale of justice and learning, like and subscribe so you don't miss more inspiring stories about people who silence their critics. Drop a comment telling us about a time you were underestimated or when you learned not to judge someone too quickly. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Hit that notification bell so you're first to see our next story. See you in the next video.